The jungle below was a living, breathing nightmare. Captain Jim Wallace pressed his face closer to the cockpit window of the C-47 Skitran, watching the green hell unfold beneath him like a carpet of death. Papua New Guinea, September 1943. The Owen Stanley Range stretched endlessly in every direction. Mountains so steep they seemed to grow vertically from the earth, valleys so deep sunlight barely reached the floor, and forests so thick a man could disappear 3 feet from his squad and never be found. The air was thick, heavy, the kind of humidity that stuck to your skin and made every breath feel like drowning. Another milk run to Wow, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Danny Horvath, muttered beside him, adjusting his headset. His voice carried that forced lightness men use when they're trying not to think about what could go wrong. In and out. Nothing to it. Wallace didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the mountains. There was no such thing as a milk run in New Guinea. The C-47 droned steadily at 8,000 feet, her twin Pratt & Whitney engines humming their reliable, monotonous song. Behind them, in the cargo bay, 18 crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations were strapped down tight. Critical supplies for the Australian forces holding Wow airstrip, a tiny scratch of civilization carved into the side of a mountain, surrounded on all sides by Japanese forces who wanted it back. Wow was a death trap. The airstrip was little more than a sloped dirt scar barely 3,000 feet long, perched on the edge of a ridge with mountains on 3 sides and the jungle waiting below like an open mouth. Pilots called it the carrier landing in the sky. You came in hot, dropped fast, hit the brakes hard, and prayed your plane didn't slide off the edge into oblivion. And if you made it down, you had exactly 10 minutes on the ground before Japanese fighters showed up to turn you into scrap metal. Wallace had flown this route 14 times. Each time, he'd sworn it would be the last. But here he was again. The radio crackled. Skitran 79er, this is Port Moresby Control. You are cleared direct to Wow. Weather's holding. No enemy contact reported in your sector. Godspeed. Roger that, Moresby, Wallace replied. His voice was calm. Professional. The kind of calm that comes from lying to yourself that everything's under control. Horvath glanced at the fuel gauges. We've got plenty. Should have enough for the round trip plus an hour reserve. Should, Wallace repeated. Behind them, through the thin plywood bulkhead separating the cockpit from the cargo bay, they could hear Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski moving around, double-checking the load straps. Kowalski was their crew chief, a Brooklyn kid with grease under his nails and a cigarette always tucked behind his ear. He'd kept this bird flying through hell and back. Wallace trusted him more than he trusted the weather. The C-47 was a workhorse. Ugly, slow, unarmed, but damn near indestructible. She'd been christened Lucky Lady back in California, though someone had scratched out the Lucky and written Limping in its place after a rough landing in Darwin. The name stuck. The Limping Lady. She'd earned it. Wallace banked slightly, following the valley floor. The mountains rose on either side like the walls of a cathedral, beautiful and terrifying. Clouds clung to the peaks, and somewhere below, hidden in that green abyss, were Japanese patrols, anti-aircraft batteries, and God knew what else. How long to Wow? Horvath asked. 23 minutes, Wallace said. Give or take. Give or take what? Whether we live or die. Horvath laughed. It was a nervous sound. Wallace didn't laugh. He'd seen too many planes go down in these mountains. Good planes. Good pilots. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, swallowed by the jungle without a trace. No wreckage found. No bodies recovered. Just gone. The air currents shifted. The Limping Lady bucked slightly, and Wallace adjusted trim. The clouds ahead were building. Towering cumulus formations that rose like castles in the sky, pregnant with rain and violence. Storms rolling in, Horvath observed. We'll beat it. You sure? Wallace wasn't sure about anything anymore. He was 32 years old. Before the war, he'd been a crop duster in Kansas, flying low and slow over wheat fields, feeling the wind, reading the land. He'd loved it. Simple, honest work. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and suddenly the government needed pilots who could fly anything, anywhere, in any conditions. So here he was, flying a tin can full of bullets over a jungle that wanted him dead, delivering supplies to men who might not survive the week, hoping to God he'd see another sunrise. The radio crackled again. Static. Then a voice, faint and urgent. Contact, enemy fighters, Salamaua. Wallace and Horvath exchanged glances. "That's not our sector," Horvath said quickly. "No," Wallace agreed. "But it's close. Too close." The limping lady droned on. The jungle below seemed to pulse with hidden menace. Every shadow could be an enemy position. Every clearing could be a trap. And then, in the distance, Wallace saw it. Wow! A thin ribbon of brown dirt clinging to the mountainside. Smoke rose from a few scattered buildings. The airstrip looked impossibly small from this altitude, like trying to land on a postage stamp. "There she is," Horvath said. "Home sweet hell." Wallace began his descent. The engines changed pitch. The limping lady nosed down, and the jungle rushed up to meet them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Or maybe it was gunfire. In New Guinea, it was hard to tell the difference. The limping lady dropped through the cloud layer like a stone through water. Wallace's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, throttle back, trim adjusted, flaps deployed in stages. The C-47 responded sluggishly, wallowing through the turbulent air like a drunk elephant. Beside him, Horvath called out altitudes and airspeed, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. 6,000 feet. Airspeed 140. Looking good. The clouds broke apart, and suddenly the world snapped into brutal clarity. Mountains. Everywhere. Rising like fangs from the jungle floor, their peaks wreathed in mist, their slopes covered in vegetation so thick it looked like moss from this height. And there, clinging to the side of a ridge like a scar, was Wow Airstrip. It looked even smaller than Wallace remembered. "Jesus," Horvath whispered. Wallace keyed the radio. "Wow Tower, this is Skitran 79er on final approach. Request landing clearance." A burst of static. Then, 79er, Wow Tower. "You are cleared to land. Wind is calm. Be advised, enemy patrol spotted 2 miles northeast. Make it quick." "Roger that." Of course there was an enemy patrol. There was always an enemy patrol. Wallace lined up with the airstrip. The approach was insane. You had to fly straight toward a mountain wall, then drop at the last second, threading between 2 ridgelines while simultaneously losing altitude fast enough to touch down on the upslope of the runway. Too high and you'd overshoot into the mountain. Too low and you'd slam into the trees at the approach end. The margin for error was measured in seconds and feet. 3,130 knots. Horvath's voice was tighter now. Wallace could see the airstrip clearly. A handful of Australian soldiers were waving them in. A few tents. Some supply crates stacked haphazardly. The whole installation looked like it could be packed up and abandoned in 10 minutes. Which, Wallace reflected, was probably the plan. 2,120. The trees rushed past below, so close Wallace could see individual leaves. The limping lady shuddered as she fought the mountain thermals. Wallace adjusted power, felt the plane settle, then pulled back gently on the yoke. The main wheels kissed the dirt with a jarring thump. Wallace immediately reversed props and stood on the brakes. The C-47 skidded and bounced along the rough strip, throwing up clouds of red dust. The mountain wall loomed ahead, growing larger with terrifying speed. "Come on, baby," Wallace muttered. "Come on." The limping lady slowed. 50 knots. 40. 30. They stopped with 200 feet of runway to spare. "And that," Horvath said, exhaling hard, "is why I drink." Wallace taxied to the unloading area. Before the props had fully stopped spinning, Kowalski was already throwing open the cargo door. Australian soldiers swarmed the plane, forming a human chain to offload the supplies with practiced efficiency. An officer appeared at Wallace's window, a captain with a dirt-streaked face and eyes that had seen too much. "How long can you stay?" he shouted over the engine noise. 8 minutes, Wallace shouted back. "Make it 5. Japs are getting bold. We've had zeros buzzing us all morning." Wallace's stomach tightened. Zeros! The Mitsubishi A6M fighter was faster, more maneuverable, and infinitely more dangerous than the lumbering C-47. If a zero caught them in the air, it would be a slaughter. He watched the cargo disappear into waiting hands. Ammunition crates. Medical supplies. Food. Each crate represented lives saved or lost. Each delivery was a small victory against the jungle, the enemy, the war itself. 4 minutes. Kowalski appeared in the cockpit doorway. "We're clear, Skipper. Let's get the hell." The sound hit them like a physical blow. A sharp, metallic crack that echoed off the mountains. Then another. And another. "Small arms fire!" the Australian captain screamed. "Get airborne now." Wallace didn't need to be told twice. His hands flew across the controls. Mixture rich, props full forward, throttles to the firewall. The engines roared. The limping lady lurched forward, accelerating down the slope. More gunfire. Closer this time. Wallace could see muzzle flashes in the tree-line 300 yards away. Bullets kicked up dirt alongside the runway. "They're in the jungle," Horvath yelled. "Jesus, they're everywhere." The C-47 picked up speed. 40 knots. 50. The mountain wall loomed ahead. They were running out of runway, running out of time. "Rotate!" Horvath screamed. Wallace hauled back on the yoke. The limping lady clawed into the air, her wheels clearing the trees at the end of the runway by less than 20 feet. The jungle flashed past below in a green blur. The plane climbed sluggishly, fighting for altitude, her engines screaming. And then Wallace felt it. A shudder. A vibration that shouldn't be there. "What was that?" Horvath said. Wallace didn't answer. His eyes were scanning the instruments. Oil pressure. Normal. Engine temps. Normal. Hydraulics. His blood turned to ice. The fuel gauge for the left tank was dropping. "Fast, Danny," he said quietly. "We're losing fuel." Horvath stared at the gauge. "That's not possible. We just—" Another shudder ran through the plane. Behind them, Kowalski shouted something unintelligible. Wallace keyed the intercom. "Ski, get to the left wing and tell me what you see." "On it." 30 seconds of agonizing silence. The limping lady continued climbing, but the fuel gauge continued falling. They were at 3,000 feet now, barely above the mountain peaks, with 40 miles of hostile jungle between them and Port Moresby. Kowalski's voice came back, tight with fear. "Skipper, we've got a problem. Big problem. There's a hole in the left wing tank. Fuel's pouring out like a damn waterfall. I can see it streaming back in the slipstream." Wallace closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, his voice was calm. "How bad?" "Bad enough that we're not making it home." Horvath turned to Wallace. "Jim, what do we do?" Wallace looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was falling like a stone. At this rate, they had maybe 20 minutes of flight time left. Port Moresby was 40 minutes away. The math was simple. And brutal. They were going down. The only question was where. The cockpit fell silent except for the steady drone of the engines and the sick whisper of fuel bleeding into the sky. Wallace's mind raced. 20 minutes of fuel. 40 minutes to Port Moresby. The math was unforgiving. Options, he said aloud. Give me options. Horvath was already unfolding a map across his lap, his finger tracing valleys and ridges. We could try for Dobadura. It's closer, maybe 30 minutes southeast. Through Japanese-controlled territory, Wallace said flatly, with fighters in the area. Then we go down in the jungle, Kowalski's voice came through the intercom. Find a clearing. Any clearing. Wallace looked down. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, a solid carpet of green broken only by mountains and the occasional river. A clearing meant a space maybe 50 feet wide if they were lucky. Landing a C-47, wingspan 95 feet, in 50 feet was suicide. But staying in the air was also suicide. There's a third option, Horvath said quietly. He pointed to a spot on the map. The Lacakamu River Valley. It's a dry riverbed this time of year, wide, flat, mostly clear. It runs roughly parallel to our heading for about 5 miles. Wallace studied the map. The riverbed was 22 miles away. At their current speed and rate of fuel loss. We'll be running on fumes, he said. We're already running on fumes. Wallace made the decision. Set course for Lacakamu. Danny, plot it. Ski, get back here and strap in. If we're going down, we're going down together. The limping lady banked left. The jungle tilted beneath them. Wallace reduced power slightly, trading speed for fuel economy. Every second counted now. Every drop of fuel was gold. The left fuel gauge read 1/4 tank. Falling. How much time? Wallace asked. Horvath checked his watch, rechecked the map. 17 minutes to the riverbed. Maybe. And the fuel? I'd say 15 minutes. Optimistically. Wallace nodded. 2 minutes short. 2 minutes between life and death. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. That surprised him. He'd always wondered how he'd react when death became a certainty instead of a possibility. Now he knew. You just keep flying. The mountains rose and fell beneath them. The jungle looked almost peaceful from this height, like a painting, something unreal and distant. Wallace knew better. Down there, men were dying in that green hell. Dying of disease, of wounds, of hunger, of loneliness. Dying and disappearing without a trace. At least if they crashed, someone might find the wreckage. 10 minutes to the riverbed, Horvath announced. The left engine coughed. Every man in the cockpit froze. The engine caught again, smoothed out. But the message was clear. The left tank was nearly empty. When it ran dry, they'd lose that engine. And with one engine, in these mountains, they'd lose altitude fast. Switch to cross-feed, Wallace ordered. Pull from the right tank. Horvath threw the switch. The fuel would now feed both engines from the remaining right tank, buying them a few more precious minutes. But it was a stopgap measure. They were still bleeding fuel from the hole in the left wing. Still dying. There. Kowalski pointed through the windscreen. 2 o'clock. That's gotta be it. Wallace saw it, a pale scar cutting through the jungle. The Lacakamu riverbed. From this height it looked narrow. Too narrow. But it was all they had. 5 minutes, Horvath said. His voice was tight. The left engine coughed again. This time it took longer to catch. Wallace began his descent. Nose down, power back. The limping lady dropped toward the jungle. The riverbed grew larger, wider. Wallace could see rocks, fallen logs, patches of sand and gravel. and he could see how narrow it really was. "Oh, Christ," Horvath whispered. "Jim, that's maybe 60 feet wide. Our wingspan is 95. "I know. We can't. I know." But there was no choice. The left engine was running on vapor. The right engine wouldn't be far behind. They were 3 minutes from total power loss. 2,000 feet. 1,500. 1,000. The jungle rushed up to meet them. Wallace could see individual trees now, could see the texture of the leaves, the shadows beneath the canopy. Birds scattered. A troop of something, monkeys maybe, fled through the branches. 500 feet, Horvath called. "Jim, you need to commit. Now." Wallace made his decision. "I'm going to drag the wings through the trees. The jungle will slow us down. Maybe enough." "That's insane. You got a better idea?" Horvath was silent. Wallace lined up with the riverbed. It was impossibly narrow. The trees on either side were massive, hardwoods that had stood for centuries. He would thread the fuselage down the center of the riverbed and let the wings tear through the jungle canopy. The trees would rip the wings apart, but the violence would also kill their forward momentum. If they hit at the right angle, at the right speed. 300 feet. The left engine died with a final, rattling cough. "Engine out!" Horvath screamed. The limping lady yawed hard left. Wallace stood on the right rudder, fighting to keep the nose straight. The plane wanted to spin, wanted to roll inverted and slam into the jungle. Wallace fought her. His legs shook with the effort of holding the rudder pedal down. 200 feet. He could see individual rocks in the riverbed now. A fallen tree trunk. The skeleton of some long-dead animal. 100 feet. "Brace! Brace! Brace!" Wallace shouted. The trees rose on either side like walls. The limping lady's wingtips entered the canopy. The world exploded. The sound was apocalyptic, a grinding, tearing, screaming chaos of metal and wood. The plane shook violently. The windscreen cracked. The left wing disintegrated, torn apart by massive tree trunks. Branches punched through the fuselage. Leaves and debris filled the air. Wallace held the yoke centered. Held it steady. The plane was coming apart around him, but he kept flying. Kept fighting. The right wing hit something massive, an enormous hardwood, and snapped cleanly off. The fuselage tilted. Rolled. The ground rushed up. The impact drove the breath from Wallace's lungs. Everything went black. And then, silence. The terrible, absolute silence after violence. Wallace opened his eyes. He was hanging in his harness. Blood ran down his face. His ears were ringing. His left arm screamed with pain. But he was alive. "Danny?" he croaked. "Ski." A groan from beside him. Horvath was conscious, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but conscious. From behind them, "Still here, Skipper. Still breathing." Wallace looked through what remained of the windscreen. The limping lady had carved a path of destruction through the jungle. Both wings were gone. The tail section was crumpled. But the fuselage, the cargo bay where they sat, was relatively intact. They'd made it. Against all odds, against physics and fate and death itself, they'd made it. Wallace closed his eyes and laughed. It was a broken, hysterical sound. They'd escaped the jungle. But now they were in it. The jungle swallowed sound. Wallace hung in his harness for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, listening to the silence. It was wrong, that silence. After the screaming violence of the crash, the world had gone unnaturally quiet, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if these intruders would live or die. "We need to move," Horvath said. His voice was thick, slurred. "Fuel. Fire. Right." The crash could have ruptured fuel lines. One spark and the wreckage would become their tomb. Wallace fumbled with his harness release. His left arm wouldn't cooperate. Something was wrong with the shoulder, so he used his right hand. The buckle clicked. He dropped awkwardly, his legs nearly giving out when his boots hit the canted cockpit floor. "Ski," he called. "You mobile?" "Yeah." Kowalski appeared in the cockpit doorway, his face streaked with blood and oil. "Little banged up, but I can walk." "You?" "Same." Together they got Horvath out of his seat. The co-pilot had a deep gash across his forehead and possibly a concussion, but he could stand. They moved through the destroyed fuselage, stepping over twisted metal and scattered supplies. Outside, the jungle was a wall of green. The limping lady had carved a scar through the forest, 100 yards of splintered trees, torn earth, and scattered wreckage. Both wings lay crumpled in the undergrowth like dead birds. The tail section had separated completely, 40 feet back along their crash path. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, the fuel. It coated the leaves, pooled in depressions, created rainbows on standing water. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and chemical and dangerous. "We need to get clear," Wallace said. "At least 100 yards. If something ignites." They moved. Wallace's shoulder sent lightning bolts of agony through his body with every step, but he moved. They all moved. Survival demanded it. They found a small clearing 50 yards from the wreck and collapsed. For a long moment, nobody spoke. They simply sat, breathing, processing the fact that they were alive. Kowalski broke the silence. "So, that was fun. Let's never do that again." Despite everything, Wallace smiled. "Agreed." Horvath was staring back at the wreckage. "How did we survive that?" "I don't know," Wallace admitted. "I honestly don't know. But they had." Against mathematics, against physics, against every reasonable expectation, they'd survived. The jungle had tried to kill them. The crash had tried to kill them, and they were still breathing. The question now was, for how long? "Where are we?" Horvath asked. Wallace pulled out his map. It was crumpled and stained with blood, but readable. He studied their last heading, estimated their distance traveled. "Best guess? We're about 18 miles south-southwest of Wow. Maybe 20 miles northeast of Port Moresby." "That's not so bad," Kowalski said. 20 miles? We could walk that in." "Through the jungle?" Wallace shook his head. "In this terrain? With no trail? We're looking at 3, maybe 4 days. If we're lucky. If we don't get lost. If we don't run into Japanese patrols. If we don't die of a dozen other things first." The reality settled over them like a wet blanket. "We have to try," Horvath said quietly. "Yes," Wallace agreed. "We do." They salvaged what they could from the wreckage. Canteens. A first aid kit. Some rations. A machete. A flare gun with 3 flares. A compass. Not much, but it was something. Wallace also found his logbook, somehow intact despite the crash. He stared at it for a moment. All those flights, all those missions, all those times he'd sworn would be the last. He tucked it inside his jacket. They began walking south as the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy. The jungle was a different world. A green hell of humidity and insects and hidden dangers. Every step was a battle against roots, vines, mud, and thorns. Horvath's concussion made him stumble. Wallace's shoulder screamed. Kowalski, the youngest and fittest, took point with the machete, hacking a path through the undergrowth. By nightfall, they'd made maybe 2 miles. They stopped in a small depression, too exhausted to go further. No fire, the light would attract attention. They ate a can of cold rations and tried to sleep on the damp ground. Wallace couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the crash. the sound of the wings tearing apart, the moment of impact, the terrible certainty that they were all going to die. But they hadn't. "Skipper," Kowalski's voice in the darkness. "You awake?" "Yeah." "That landing, that was the best flying I've ever seen. You saved our lives." Wallace didn't know what to say to that. He'd just done what needed doing. Kept flying until the very end. Wasn't that what pilots did? Get some sleep, Ski. "Yes, sir." The jungle sounds surrounded them. Insects, birds, something larger moving through the undergrowth. Wallace fingered the flare gun beside him and wondered if they'd have to use it before morning. But the night passed, and when dawn came, they walked. 3 days they walked. Through rivers that rose to their chests. Over ridges that left them gasping. Through mud that sucked at their boots. Horvath's condition worsened. Fever set in, probably infection from his head wound. Kowalski carried him when he couldn't walk. Wallace navigated by compass and instinct, always south, always pushing forward. His shoulder had stopped hurting, which he knew was a bad sign. The arm hung useless at his side. But they walked. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they heard it. Voices. Speaking English. Wallace fired a flare into the sky. Red smoke billowed above the jungle canopy. 20 minutes later, an Australian patrol found them. They were carried out, taken to Port Moresby on litters. Wallace remembered little of the journey. Fever had set in. Everything became a blur of pain and exhaustion. He woke 2 days later in a hospital tent. A doctor stood over him. "Welcome back, Captain. You're going to be fine." Dislocated shoulder, some cuts and bruises, dehydration, but you'll live. "My crew. Lieutenant Horvath is in surgery. Skull fracture, but the docs think he'll pull through. Sergeant Kowalski is fine. That kid's made of steel. He's already asking when he can get back to work." Wallace closed his eyes. They'd all made it. Against everything, they'd all made it. "Captain," the doctor said, "I need to ask. How did you land that plane?" "The wreckage team says both wings were sheared off, the fuselage was destroyed, but somehow you walked away." "How?" Wallace thought about it. About the fuel pouring out. About the impossible choice. About threading the jungle at 100 miles per hour with no power and no hope. "I just kept flying," he said finally. "Even when we were falling. Even when the wings came off. I just kept flying." The doctor nodded slowly. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. They're calling it a miracle." But Wallace knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was training, luck, desperation, and the sheer stubborn refusal to die. It was 3 men who wouldn't give up, even when giving up was the only rational choice. It was the limping lady, living up to her name one last time. He never flew another combat mission. Medical discharge. The shoulder never fully healed. But Wallace didn't mind. He'd beaten the jungle once. He wasn't going to press his luck. Years later, after the war, he went back to Kansas. Back to crop dusting. Back to flying low and slow over wheat fields. Simple, honest work. And every time he climbed into the cockpit, he thought of that day. Of fuel pouring out into the sky. Of trees tearing wings apart. Of the moment when the ground rushed up and everything should have ended. But didn't. He'd walked away from the jungle. And the jungle had let him go. Not everyone who entered that green hell could say the same.